Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic ReCon Testimonies from Reverts and Converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. This week's guest is Deborah Ann Keefe. I'm going to mention her website right off the bat because it's pretty cool. DeborahAnnKeefe.com. DeborahAnnKeefe. She's an author, counselor, musician. And she's going to talk about her journey. But if I'm not mistaken, you have a program essentially, and you have a book out that talks about music as a portion of your healing. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Music was the vehicle of receiving God's love, divine healing love. So,
Beautiful.
yeah.
So we will definitely get into that. Where did your faith journey start, Deborah?
Well, I grew up Catholic, Irish Catholic family on Long Island, New York. I went to Notre Dame, received the sacraments, and was blessed really in the faith. Was involved in the music ministry. My father taught drum and bugle corps. So I said I grew up. I had to have a beat, and little did I know how important that heartbeat connected to the rhythm of music would become, essential actually to my work. I always loved God, always loved the church, and but there was a disconnect, unfortunately, over time, as with many families. My father had that beautiful. He was a second generation German immigrant and grew up in poverty and many losses in the family. And he used music and the faith absolutely for healing, but he struggled with alcoholism. So, but as that played out, that was the loophole, if you will, for to leave the church over time. So I do have a revert story, because I thought, why isn't God, solving my father's alcoholism? And it became destructive to the family. And, my parents were living the faith to the best of their ability. They went to a priest for counseling, for pastoral care. And the real break was that priest ended up, unfortunately, sleeping with the police chief's wife. So I grew up in a very small town on the east end of Long Island. It was beautiful, beaches, and everyone knew everything about everyone. And here, I had this very respectful family that was giving so much to the community. And I was involved in everything in school, music, and president of the honor society. And but there was this hidden issue in our family. I thought, the church, that God could solve everything. And when my parents' marriage, 30-year marriage, ended in divorce, that was the sword that hit my heart and separated me from the church,
How old
over
were you at
time.
that time?
I was 14, age range where you're looking for your identity separate from your parents and your family. And yeah, it's a real struggle. And I think, like what we see in today's societies is the youth are looking for authenticity, and where words and actions really meet. And with all my love for God, and I grew up, my mom was always praying, always helping others. Mass was so important. And there was something missing. There was a missing link. And as we know, the spiritual battle, I never formally left the church, but when I went off to college, that was when I was just, I always remained Christian,
Hmm.
but ended up becoming Methodist later on.
What was was there something attractive about that faith?
Yeah, actually, my husband, I met my husband a few years after college. And, what I wanted most, divorce is such a struggle. There's tremendous suffering on every family member with divorce. And my husband had a wonderful family that had stayed together through the ups and downs. were very community oriented, very welcoming. And so that's, and the music just connected, right? I could share the music. But coming back later on, it was, how do you describe how much you miss when you leave the Catholic faith, right? But it's important to know, like I work for a Christian agency, Christian Counseling Associates, and my Protestant friends are brothers and sisters. They're not enemies. I wasn't, I never stopped loving God ever. And I never stopped reading the Bible. That time period in my life, I really grew deeply in a personal relationship with the Lord. So, yeah.
So being away from God, so from maybe age what, 14 until college years, was there ever a period where you just simply were not attending church, not praying?
Yeah, I would say I remained Catholic until I went to college. So until 18. The struggle after my parents' divorce was that at that point, it was a very old Roman Catholic church, and my mother was not allowed to receive communion, of course. And that was very painful. She'd been my confirmation teacher, she taught CCD for many years. When with a mother and a child, when you struggle to see your mother not accepted, it just goes. And my mother, um, part of her legacy that I'm living through is she was so joyful in the Lord and really believed in the resurrection. Easter was her favorite holiday. Christmas was wonderful, but Easter was, she had that full belief that we're born again, that we're new creations, that with confession, we receive clean slate. It's very hard when you separate a mother and a child in a spiritual way, because your mothers and children are connected in a very different way, biologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically. But I never formally left the church. I just was, I went to Boston University, and, the New Age was kind of, happening at that point. They had a Marsh Chapel on campus, and it was like everyone's welcome, everyone can attend. And when you move away for college and you're vulnerable, looking for community, that was ultimately where I went. But the Lord had a plan,
Cl
and He
cl
brought me back. Yeah.
Clearly. So
Yeah.
the Methodist church was a few years after that, because you were saying the kind of that new age influence was earlier in college, and then
Yes.
Method.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So college years, nothing major, but some new age, I probably purchased a crystal, or,
Uh,
read some cards, or, nothing major or serious, thank you, God, but things I had to renounce later. Um, yeah, I was married in 1992. So that was when really I was married in the Methodist church and really lived that for about 20 years.
okay.
Um,
So was there any desire during those 20 years to go back to the Catholic Church, or did you have family that was asking questions during that period of time to figure out, hey, when are you going to come back?
when are you
Or
going to
was
come back? Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a good question. One of the things I've learned in spiritual warfare, it's like I was blinded. It's like I couldn't even see the Catholic Church anymore, the sacraments. I don't know how to explain it, except I know that I have tremendous compassion for those who are separated from the church, because you just never would have expected it. Like I loved God, I loved the church, but it was this wound in my family. And so my mother had left the church. My sister ended up getting married a few years after I did, and they were in. Her husband was Armenian, and so they had an Orthodox wedding, and that was actually probably the only Catholic service I went to in those years. But it stayed with me. The holiness, the incense, the kneeling. So I would also share at that time. with a family where, my father was an alcoholic, that I was involved in 12-step programs. For me, I had a food addiction, a sugar addiction. So thank you, God, it wasn't alcohol or drugs or anything else. But so I was living, with the Bible, with the Methodist faith, and with 12-step programs,
Mm.
which are based on telling the truth, just, no matter how it looks like, and, the self-discipline, the self-control. Um, and I was really blessed at 25 years old, before I had met my husband, that I realized, some of the issues in my family. And I asked God, I really had a deep relationship with him. I said, Lord, let me be the change. I know things there, absolutely, we had a nice home, a good education, vacations, but there was also this trail of when my father would drink, there were times he would be violent. And, there's that thread that comes through, and I didn't want that to go forward. I wanted wholeness. I wanted health and wholeness. So there's really been a blessing on my life because I was allowed to experience, to a small degree, some of the very tragic things that can happen in life. But with each experience, the Blessed Mother was with me, literally showing me, like it was like a teaching, so that, in my work and in my life today, I use all of that. I know how to heal it, and the Lord's come through my life as a healer. But so I had this time in my life, seasons of blessings, seasons of suffering, both. I had both. But ultimately, where the Lord was teaching me, drawing me back to Him and showing me how to heal, myself and then others.
Okay, so
Um,
that was happening in the Methodist Church, and then obviously when you reverted into the
yes,
Catholic Church. Okay, so can you talk about
yes,
two big parts? What
yeah,
happened that led to the true reversion back into the church, and then
yeah,
also what is that healing practic? What does that look like? If you give
yeah.
an example of that.
That sounds great. Yeah, and unfortunately, with uh, not being married Catholic, one of the things I really promote is Catholic marriages because you have the grace, right? The sacrament of marriage and the grace. And then my husband we were living in New Hampshire. He was a professor, Southern New Hampshire University, and it was very, very liberal environment. And so, unfortunately, even though we had the gift of two beautiful, amazing daughters that I homeschooled and lived a beautiful Christian life, just you could see the Lord. We started the day with the Bible and with classical music, and one daughter's a violinist, the other's a ballerina. The Lord was always with me, and the joy, the faith was there, but it didn't have the blessing of the sacraments. So my husband was led astray, infidelity, and to a point where it had to end in divorce. So, when you give your life and when all you want is your family, that was all I wanted, was to build a healthy, strong family. And that's what my father died a month after my divorce.
Oh,
His few, yeah,
I'm
like
so
really,
sorry, Deborah.
yeah,
Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
yeah, yeah. So this is why I'm not afraid to go through anything. The Lord has brought me through the valley, with joy, with the outcome of joy is ultimately because by walking through this with Him, what I have found is His love, and that He will never, ever, ever leave me, ever. you know, and that's the joy, is that, after having, experienced a divorce as a child and then as an adult, and I was just crushed. But at my father's funeral, which was at the church that I had had my sacraments growing up, it was my father's parting gift. And when I, saw his coffin, I guess three things happened. Was at the wake, I was called to put my hand on my father's heart. And one of the gifts in our relationship was that I always loved him. And I knew there was just an illness of some sort. I never hated him. I knew God was good. I didn't understand what was wrong with my father, but I always loved my father. And when I came to the coffin, I was called to put my hand on his heart, and he'd been dead a week, and his heart was warm. I think that was an anointing at that point, really now. And in some sense, it was my father's last gift to me to know that his love was eternal. Um, so it was beautiful. And then at the funeral, I I saw, the statue of Jesus. I had looked at the Sacred Heart of Jesus as a child. And perhaps with his death, I was reconciled. The disconnect was reconciled. And
What year was that, Deborah?
that was 2008.
Okay.
So I've been back in the faith 17, yeah, 17
So
years.
did you end up
Yeah.
going to a regular Sunday mass right after that?
Very, very soon after, I first went to a monastery, Most Precious Blood Monastery, in Manchester, New Hampshire. Friends, like the Lord just started orchestrating, bringing people into my life to bring me back. And and I remember actually I brought my children with me, and they'd not been to a Catholic service before Mass, and watching them experience the holiness for the first time, I thought, oh my goodness, what have I done? Right. And so I love to share the story of my first confession. And it was at St. Marie's in Manchester, New Hampshire, Father Maurice. And he just, it was just, of course, with anyone, a lot of tears, and ultimately for me, the story of confession was that I had rejected God's love, right? And whatever situations or things that happened, I'd rejected his love. And my penance, and the priest had tears, I had tears. I was like, oh my gosh, why didn't, why, right? And of course, as many children of divorce will do, they blame themselves for their parents' divorce. And, so self-hatred, self-blame, these things really can affect us. But the most beautiful thing, Father Maurice, my penance was to join the choir, which was, there it was. The Lord was preparing the way. And of course, I joined two choirs and just immersed myself in the faith. And from that moment forward, I have been so blessed with the grace of God that the faith became real to me. And Jesus, the first time I received communion, Jesus whispered in my ear that he loved me. When he, just receiving his love, this is right. The Eucharist is his heart. um, that, there isn't anyone who has had, too much happen to them or strayed too far. It doesn't matter. You know, um, we're all equal in the eyes of the Lord. Sometimes the more suffering, the more grace, the more love, So, yeah, I became immersed in the faith. I started, went to a Life in the Spirit seminar, a
What's that?
Cursia.
What's that? I've heard of Curcio. What's life in the spirit?
Yeah. Life in the Spirit is part of the charismatic movement.
Okay.
So
Gifts of the
it's
Holy
where you
Spirit.
receive, yeah, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And I was blessed with many spiritual gifts. Yeah, I do receive words of prophecy and most recently healing, gifts of healing, gifts of wisdom, teaching and counsel. So,
So you're able
um,
to bring that into the work that you do. So
yes.
okay, maybe you can get into how you incorporate music
Mhm.
into that process because I
Wonderful.
think when I first met you, first of all, it's pretty cool. We met at the Eucharistic revival
Yes. Yes.
in when was that? July. Yeah, middle
July.
of July. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
When you said music is healing, I just pictured people singing, and I don't know if
Yes.
I don't know. Why don't you tell the audience what that looks like?
Okay. Well, that was the common thread in my life that kept me well, certainly not perfect, but well, was music. So, growing up with music and then studying, I'm a flutist, studied classical music since I was 8. And um, one of the aspects of for music as healing, there's many different aspects of how it works to heal, but one of them, when you belong to a choir or an orchestra, you actually are coming together, this social belonging, this social connection, and you are breathing together, your hearts are beating together, your souls are connected, and you're creating, ideally, one of the most beautiful sounds in the world is, you listen to some of the beautiful orchestras and choirs, um, and so it's a selfless act. Sometimes people don't realize that when you're a musician, how selfless it is, because you have to step out of your own wants, needs, and desires to connect and be part of others to create something beautiful.
Mm.
So there's a real a spiritual connection. So this can help with clients that are struggling with anxiety and depression, social anxiety disorder, social withdrawal, and isolation. So one of the things I always suggest to clients who are struggling to connect and trust others is to join a choir if they're not instrumentally based, so you get that rising above for the betterment of others as a social group. The other thing that happens with music is going back to this heartbeat, is that when you play music, whatever the rhythm is, whatever the beat of the music is, ultimately anyone in the room, their heart will start beating at the beat of the music. Yeah. Sometimes I like to teach by, I don't want to say extremes, but sometimes we can see an extreme example will illustrate the point. So many years ago in Boston, went to a concert with my husband, and I think the band was Kataro. It was a Japanese drumming band, and the very, very loud. It was quite an experience. But what happened, literally, because of the level of sound, the volume, and the strength of the rhythm, that everyone in that concert hall, you could actually see their bodies moving up and down to the rhythm of that drum beat. So it was more than, when you go to a concert and everyone starts tapping their foot, right? It just happens. It's an autonomic response. Automatically your body is responding to the beat that powerfully. Then what happens is your heart is absolutely responding to the beat. When my daughters were 16 and 18, I went for the master's degree in social work after raising them in music and the arts and academics. I had seen in those 20 years, if you will, a level of health and wellness that when I went back out into the world after raising them, I thought, what's different about what I did and others? And music was a core component as well as faith, as and I knew ethically that I had to pursue and understand this connection. In orchestral concerts, my daughter was in Boston with she studied with a violinist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra at 15. And my other daughter was, graduating high school at 17 with an English scholarship and getting into conservatory and ballet. There's so many ways music it goes. So no one was talking about mental health issues or cancer when we were in these environments with other parents and socializing, when we were in these, musical connections, ballet connections, homeschool connections. The level of health and wellness was significantly different. than when I'd go out into the general population. And that's why. So I went for the MSW. I took a program, studied a program called the Healing and Transition Program, Music for Healing and Transition, mhtp.org. So that's where I was specifically trained in this. But one of the things we did as an internship in that program is we were prescribed, literally prescribed in the medical field to go into patients' rooms to reduce anxiety, relieve depression, you know, and there was a patient I went into in the ICU that was preparing for heart surgery. Of course, the anxiety was off the charts, and they couldn't medicate the anxiety because he was preparing for heart surgery. So this is the most visual example of how it works. So I went in with my flute and knew that ultimately I needed to play music that would not increase emotion, that was relatively neutral emotionally, and that the beat of the music was, 60 to 80 beats, which is a normal heartbeat. And I went in and literally watching the monitors as I'm playing, watched his heartbeat go from 140 beats a minute to 60 beats a minute in minutes. And all I did was go in the room and play my flute, a classical piece of music by Handel. Yeah,
Wow. Do you have
yeah.
your flute with you right now?
I don't. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Darn it, Deborah. No, I'm joking.
I'm sorry. I'm at work.
Yeah.
I should have brought
Because
it.
my
Yeah.
heart rate's at 95. I was hoping you could get it down to 65. So,
Oh, that's great. I would love to. We'll plan I could actually, if you wanted, share some music. Because I do this with clients where I'll bring them to a screen and YouTube and share other examples of music that will do this.
yeah, send some of those links to me.
Okay. Very
Definitely.
happy to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
really fascinating what you just
Yeah.
shared.
Yeah.
But I did
Yeah.
interject. Was there anything else about the
Oh, there's
healing?
so much.
Yeah,
But
maybe.
the anxiety is the key, right? Because we're living in a world of anxiety. And of course, I think it's so important in the faith. We don't ever want to shame anyone. That's not of the Lord, right? If anyone reads the news, of course they're going to have an element of anxiety. Our world is in a state of change that's a little bit scary, right? What's going to happen?
Sure.
Um, so it doesn't, I want to be really clear, of course, that in my own life, I've had times of anxiety. You wake up and there's fear, you pray, and then you put on music, And so, it doesn't stay with me. And that when ultimately you use music enough and play music, that the body just adjusts. I don't live with any anxiety. I haven't for years.
Incredible.
Certainly, there's a moment you hear something, it's like, oh no, what happened, right? And you have to process it. But my mind is calm. My
Yeah, I
heart is calm.
remember, I don't know who it was that first said it, probably in my late 20s, early 30s. He said, and it was probably my wife, now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah,
Uh, be careful. Don't listen to certain types of songs if you're feeling a certain way. It's probably
yes,
not going to help. It's probably just going to take it, whatever it
right.
was, frustration. It's probably just going to make it worse.
Yes,
Do you
yeah,
have, because people get in these habits of they have certain genres of music that they love. Do
right,
you run into
right.
that where you have to remind them, hey, maybe something a little calmer? Maybe
Yeah, absolutely.
maybe not
Yeah,
speed metal when you're feeling frustrated?
right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because people will naturally choose music that resonates with how they feel. The challenge here is if they're angry and they're choosing heavy metal or rock or certain forms of rap, that another aspect of music that will really affect them is that ultimately what happens is the soul of the musician. Think about when you fell in love with your wife, right? And at some point there was a song that became your love song, right? It's, this is always a beautiful thing as I work with couples. I'm like, tell me about your love song and what that was like and when you met. And when you're 90 years old, that song will come on and you will feel that love, right? So music is also a channel of soul ties. The souls connect through music. So unfortunately, when you listen to heavy metal, hard rock, AC/DC, right? Kiss, Back in Black, the soul of the musician, who unfortunately is spending a good amount of their life singing and playing angry music. So that soul is in need of help. That soul is resonating anger. And so if you listen to it, right, it's one thing to listen to it once and like get the anger out and be done with it and go on to more peaceful music. But those that immerse themselves in that kind of music, I've had clients, I've seen this, where I'm like, oh my gosh, this family is really angry. And you do a full assessment as a counselor, and what are the generational issues? What could be the biomedical issues? Like a detective trying to figure out what's happened. Then I find out their family's immersed in hard rock or metal. And it will affect every single person in the home that's listening to it. Yeah.
I
So,
wholeheartedly I've seen that. I've
yeah,
been immersed in that
yeah,
and recognized that it wasn't helpful at all. And in fact,
yeah, yeah,
um, in these at these metal concerts, if I may go back in
yeah,
time here, at these metal
yes, yeah,
concerts, you'd see a bunch of kids that are broken, in pain, but they find community. They find community in
right,
mosh pits. Just like I
yes,
think of these gang members, they find people that say that they're family. And
right,
so they cling to
exactly.
that. So all of a sudden, you're in the most violent, angry environment, and people are saying
Mm,
that they feel love or that they feel
right,
community when they're slamming
right,
against each
right,
other.
right,
And if you stay in that state, of course,
yeah, yeah,
that almost becomes the medicine is more anger, more
mm, yeah,
frustration, or venting in a way that I don't
yeah.
know. I don't know how you get. It's not easy to get out of that. It's
Right.
not
It's
easy
not
to
easy.
actually get out of a mosh pit sometimes. I will tell you
Right.
that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree. Yeah. And what I love that you said there is that how do they find their way there is they're looking for family, right? They're looking for a sense of belonging. And ultimately, whoever welcomes them is the door that they open, right? Which is why it's so essential in our faith to open the door, right? To welcome everyone. Because if we don't, we're allowing that to happen. God will hold us responsible for that. We're allowing that to happen if we don't welcome everyone.
Well said.
Um, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
wow. Wow, we went down the music path there. That was fun. Okay, so let's kind of tie it all together here.
Okay,
How so you've been back in the church for now 16, 17
17 years.
years.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
What
yeah,
is it like now to be able to do your work, to be in the faith? I'm assuming you're able to share your story with people
yes,
and
yes,
give them hope as well based
yes,
on your path.
yes.
What
Yeah.
else can you say about that whole bringing it to a close, that
To
journey?
close.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that um, bringing my life full circle, realizing how many blessings of healing I've received in my life. One of the things that I found out a few years ago was that my parents had been married young, married for 15 years, not able to have children. And they adopted my brother from Ireland, and my mother came back and a few years later had her appendix out, an infection, and my grandmother was a devout Catholic. And when my mother had this infection, my grandmother had just come back from Lourdes, poured holy water over my mother's infection, and it was healed, and she conceived me shortly thereafter. Um, and I had no idea, but I was called a miracle child because they'd tried 15 years. But I just have felt there's a blessing on my life, that I've been allowed to go through some of these difficult things. I've been blessed to have a beautiful life as a mother, really beautiful, beautiful years raising my children, beautiful years in my music career, homeschooling. And then God's always showed me, I've always turned to him and he showed me the solution is through him, through my life. So to wrap this up, I would share with you that as when we first met at the Eucharistic Congress, that because, no matter what's happened in my life, I've loved the Lord and I've never blamed him. I knew he was good. And when my youngest daughter, was in Wisconsin for college at conservatory, I ended up going out there. While I was out there, I was writing the book. I'd taken the music as medicine, the science, the history, and the medical experiences. And and there had been a time of spiritual struggle, and I just couldn't. I knew the Lord was trying to do something. There was a block. And, because I had become very intellectual, scholarly, I could give you all kinds of research on this subject, and I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, music works, but I wasn't fully connecting it to the source that was God, right? So this is where pride can enter in, right? So I was out in Wisconsin and praying, and the rector of the National Shrine of Our Lady of Champion was my spiritual director. And he said to me, put the book on the altar and give it to God and let him decide what happens with it. And in that year, the Lord came to me in the Eucharist. I was kneeling at a healing mass at the shrine, and the Eucharist became like the sun, except it was infinite and it was pure love. And it's never left me, literally, no matter what's happened in my life. I have this love. And when I look forward, all I see is the Eucharist, God's love. I know how perfect it is. It, I know it's infinite. I know there's plenty for everyone. And it's so humbling. I think when I struggle, it's like, why me? Why have, and a very holy friend of mine said, why not you? The Lord knew you would tell others, and receive the gift. And 2 weeks after that blessing at the shrine, I received the healing of my vision in my spine. And I had $1,200 glasses, trifocals with thick prisms. And I don't have any, since that time in 2019, and it's like the Lord wanted me to see who I am in him. Remember that wound from my childhood it must have been my fault,
Yeah. Wow.
right? And it wasn't my fault. My parents did the best they could with what they had. The church did the best they could with what they had. I did the best I could with what I had. And the Lord just wanted to love and heal me.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Also, very well said. I think a lot of people need to be
Yeah.
reminded of what you just said. So,
Yeah. And that was when, with the music, when I received the healing, we were singing. So that was, the music, the sacred music, the praise music was the vehicle of his love.
incredible.
It was the Eucharist. So with the Eucharist, there was no music happening there. We were saying the rosary. So the Eucharist is the core and the center, and then music is an additional vehicle of healing for the Holy Spirit. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing
Thank
that.
you.
What an incredible
Yeah.
reversion and a testament to God's
Yeah.
love. And as you said, what's the book name actually before I
Yes.
forget?
Canto Divina, singing
Okay.
psalms for transformation.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and that's, I'm sure, yeah, that's on your site. It's on your website.
Yes, it's on my site.
Um,
And yeah, and it's on Amazon. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we'll make sure we
And
put that in the description, and
perfect.
it's a very unique approach, and I think it's fantastic. So,
Yeah. Thank you.
appreciate you
Thank
walking
you.
through all of that. Anything
Yeah.
else you want to add before we call it?
Well, I would just add that with Canto Divina is, within that following year after all that happened spiritually, and I had the illumination of conscience that all I wanted was to share this with others. There's no element of competition or ego or pride. It's like when you receive this love, you just want others to share in
Sure.
it. So Canto Divina, as a work with Christ in adoration chapels, is a method of healing and transformation through singing, praying, and reading the Psalms in the form of similar to Lectio Divina, but adding the work of music as medicine, and the Psalms, which of course are the heart of God and David. So, yeah, I just,
So cool.
um, God wants to give. So, you don't hold anything back when you receive his love. So, I just thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah.
I've been looking forward to it, and
We
it was,
tried.
I'm,
We
yeah,
tried. We tried and we tried, Deborah, but
we did.
we finally made it. So, yeah, it was a
Yes.
pleasure
Yeah.
meeting you.
Thank
And
you, Eddie. Yes.
thanks again.
Yes. You as well. Yeah. God bless you and your family.
Same to
Yeah.
you. Everyone,
Yes.
please share the video and visit Deborah's website
Mm,
and spread
mm,
love. Yeah, you say that's
right.
so cliche. Spread love.
Fred.
Pray,
Amen.
charity, hope, faith. When you have any fraction of that, people want, I believe, people want to know about it, but the timing, that's
Mm,
where we have to be prayerful about where, when to share things, how to share things. But um, this world clearly needs a lot more of that. So
that's
thank
right.
you all. God bless you all. Till next time. Take care.